the housecat bear, Daisy's unlikely family. The autumn mist clung to the Blue Ridge Mountains like a gentle shroud, weaving through the ancient oaks and maples that surrounded Edgar Whitley's weathered cabin. At 72, Edgar had grown accustomed to the solitude that came with living on the edge of the deep Hollow Creek forest, where the only sounds were the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant babble of the creek that gave the place its name. His cabin, built from hand-hewn logs decades before he'd inherited it from his late brother, stood as a testament to simpler times, its wide front porch sagging slightly under the weight of countless seasons, the tin roof patched in places where winter storms had tested its resolve. The morning routine had become sacred to Edgar. He would rise with the sun, shuffle to the kitchen in his worn slippers, and put the kettle on for his daily cup of Earl Grey. The ritual had taken on new meaning 3 months ago when he'd rescued a small white kitten from the debris left behind by a particularly vicious storm. He'd found her mewing pitifully in a pile of garbage that had been scattered across the old logging road, her tiny body soaked and trembling. Without hesitation, he'd scooped her up, brought her home, and named her Mittens for the distinctive white markings on her paws that looked like tiny gloves. Mittens had transformed Edgar's quiet existence in ways he hadn't expected. The little cat followed him everywhere, from the creaky front porch where he liked to sit and watch the morning unfold to the small vegetable garden behind the cabin where he tended his tomatoes and beans. She had a particular fondness for perching on his shoulder while he worked, her purr a constant, comforting vibration against his neck. In the evenings, she would curl up on his lap while he read by the fireplace, her green eyes reflecting the dancing flames. On this particular October morning, Edgar was going through his usual routine, the kettle beginning to whistle as he reached for Mittens's small ceramic bowl. He'd just begun to pour the milk when an unfamiliar sound made him pause. It was a soft scraping, like claws against wood, coming from somewhere near the front porch. Mittens, who had been weaving between his legs in anticipation of her morning treat, suddenly froze. Her ears pricked forward with alert curiosity. Edgar set down the milk jug and moved toward the front door, his joints protesting with familiar aches. As he stepped onto the porch, he noticed something that made his heart skip, a small trail of mud leading from the forest edge to the space beneath his porch steps. The marks were too large to be from a raccoon, too small to be from a deer. As he bent down to investigate, a pair of gray furry ears caught his attention, barely visible in the shadows under the wooden steps. "Well, hello there," Edgar murmured softly, his voice carrying the gentle tone he'd learned to use with frightened animals during his years of occasional wildlife encounters. He tapped gently on the step, and what emerged made his breath catch in his throat. A tiny black bear cub, no bigger than a house cat, crawled out from its hiding place. The little creature was soaked to the bone, its fur matted and muddy. But what made Edgar's heart clench was the sight of its front paw, a crude metal trap, its jagged teeth designed to hold fast to whatever unfortunate creature stepped into it, was clamped tightly around the cub's delicate paw. The wound was deep, and Edgar could see where the metal had cut through fur and flesh. Yet the little bear made no sound of distress. Instead, it simply looked up at him with large, dark eyes that seemed to hold a wisdom far beyond its tender age, eyes that pleaded not for rescue, but for understanding. Edgar had seen enough injured animals in his lifetime to know that this little one was in serious trouble. The trap was old and rusty, the kind that irresponsible hunters sometimes left scattered through the forest, and the cub's paw was swelling around the metal teeth. Without the trap removed and the wound properly treated, infection would surely set in. "Easy now, little one," Edgar whispered, moving slowly back into the cabin. Mittens had followed him to the doorway and now sat watching the proceedings with the calm acceptance that seemed to characterize her approach to life's surprises. Edgar returned with the bowl of milk he'd been preparing for Mittens, setting it down carefully near the injured cub. The little bear's nose twitched at the scent of the milk, and despite its obvious pain, it began to lap at the white liquid with a tiny pink tongue. Its whole body trembled with each movement, whether from cold, fear, or pain, Edgar couldn't tell. Mittens approached cautiously, sniffing at the newcomer with scientific curiosity rather than fear or territorial aggression. She seemed to sense that this was a creature in need, not a threat to her comfortable life. Edgar knew he had to act quickly. He'd dealt with trapped animals before, though never one quite so young or vulnerable. The key was to remain calm and move slowly to avoid causing additional trauma to an already frightened creature. He retrieved his first aid kit from the cabin along with an old wool blanket that had belonged to his late wife, Sarah. The blanket still carried the faint scent of her lavender soap, a smell that had always been associated with comfort and safety in this house. Working with infinite patience, Edgar managed to position himself beside the cub. The little bear watched his every movement, but didn't try to flee, as if it understood that this human meant no harm. Edgar's weathered hands, steady despite his age, worked carefully at the trap's mechanism. The metal was old and corroded, but eventually he managed to spring the release. The cub whimpered softly as the pressure was relieved, the first sound it had made since emerging from under the porch. The wound was worse than Edgar had initially thought. The trap's teeth had punctured the paw in several places, and the surrounding tissue was already beginning to swell. Edgar cleaned the injury as gently as possible with antiseptic, his movements careful and deliberate. The cub remained remarkably still throughout the process, as if it understood that this temporary discomfort was necessary for healing. As Edgar wrapped the tiny paw in clean bandages, he found himself speaking softly to the little bear, the same way he'd once talked to Sarah during her final illness, words of comfort and reassurance, promises that everything would be all right. When he finished with the bandaging, he wrapped the cub in the wool blanket, creating a warm cocoon that seemed to calm the trembling creature. "There now," Edgar said, settling back on his heels. "You're going to be just fine. But you need a name, don't you?" He studied the small black face peering out from the blanket, noting the gentle expression in those dark eyes. Despite being a wild creature, there was something inherently peaceful about this little bear, something that reminded him of the daisies that grew wild in Sarah's old flower garden. "Daisy," he said finally. "That's what we'll call you." Daisy, as if responding to her new name, settled more deeply into the blanket, her breathing becoming slower and more regular. Mittens, who had been observing the entire proceedings with feline interest, approached and sniffed delicately at the bundle. Finding nothing threatening, she settled down beside the wrapped cub, her purr creating a soothing soundtrack to the morning's unexpected events. Edgar knew that keeping a wild bear, even a young one, was not something he could do without proper authorization. Despite his remote location and the understanding nature of his few neighbors, there were laws and regulations that governed the care of wildlife. With some reluctance, he made his way to the old rotary phone that hung on his kitchen wall and dialed the number for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. The voice that answered was young and enthusiastic, belonging to a wildlife officer named Riley Sanders. Edgar explained the situation, describing the injured cub and the circumstances of her rescue. Riley listened carefully, asking pertinent questions about the cub's condition and age. When Edgar mentioned that the little bear seemed too weak and injured to survive on her own, Riley's tone became more serious. "I'll need to come out and assess the situation," Riley said. "Can you keep the cub comfortable until I get there?" "It'll probably be this afternoon." Edgar assured him that Daisy would be well cared for. And after hanging up the phone, he returned to the porch where his two charges were waiting. Mittens had somehow managed to work her way partially under the blanket with Daisy, and the two animals were curled together in a picture of interspecies harmony that made Edgar's heart swell with unexpected emotion. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Edgar moved Daisy and her blanket inside, creating a comfortable nest near the fireplace where the warmth could help dry her fur and ease the shock of her ordeal. He offered her small amounts of milk and water, which she accepted gratefully, and was pleased to see that her appetite seemed to be returning. Mittens appointed herself as Daisy's guardian, rarely straying far from the makeshift bed and occasionally grooming the cub's ears with her rough tongue. When Riley Sanders arrived that afternoon, Edgar was struck by how young the wildlife officer looked, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of earnest enthusiasm that Edgar remembered from his own younger days. Riley carried himself with the confidence of someone who genuinely loved his work. He examined Daisy carefully, his trained hands gentle as he checked her bandages and assessed her overall condition. "You did good work here, Mr. Whitley," Riley said, settling back on his heels, much as Edgar had done that morning. "The wound is clean, and you've probably saved her life by getting that trap off when you did." He watched as Mittens approached and began grooming Daisy's ears again. "This is remarkable. I've never seen a domestic cat accept a bear cub so readily." Edgar found himself telling Riley about Mittens's own rescue, how the little white cat had been just as vulnerable and frightened when he'd found her. "Maybe she recognizes a kindred spirit," he suggested. Riley nodded thoughtfully, then grew more serious. "The thing is, Mr. Whitley, this cub is probably too young to have been weaned properly. Without her mother, and with that injury, she's not going to survive in the wild. Normally, we'd take her to a wildlife rehabilitation center, but..." He paused, watching as Daisy nuzzled against Mittens's side. "The nearest facility is overcrowded right now, and honestly, she seems to be thriving here." Edgar felt a flutter of hope in his chest, but tried to keep his expression neutral. "What are you suggesting?" "There's a special permit program for elderly residents who are willing to provide long-term care for orphaned wildlife that can't be released," Riley explained. "It's not common, and it requires annual inspections and a lot of paperwork, but if you're willing, I think I could make a case for Daisy staying here with you." The relief that washed over Edgar was stronger than he'd expected. In just one day, the little bear had already become part of his small family, and the thought of losing her to an uncertain fate at an overcrowded facility was more painful than he cared to admit. "I'd be honored to care for her," he said simply. Riley spent the next hour filling out forms and taking photographs, documenting Daisy's condition and the setup Edgar had created for her care. Before he left, he promised to return in a few weeks to check on her progress and to bring the official permit once it was approved. As evening approached and Riley's truck disappeared down the winding dirt road, Edgar found himself sitting in his favorite armchair with an unprecedented sense of completeness. Mittens was curled in her usual spot on his lap, while Daisy, still wrapped in her blanket, had somehow managed to position herself so that she was touching both Edgar's foot and Mittens's tail. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, and for the first time in months, Edgar felt truly at peace. That night, Edgar constructed a small wooden pen near the fireplace, thinking it would provide Daisy with a safe, contained space to sleep. He lined it with soft blankets and placed a small water dish inside, proud of his handiwork. However, when he woke the next morning, he found the pen empty, and Daisy curled up in her preferred spot right beside Mittens on the old braided rug in front of the fireplace. This pattern repeated itself for several nights. No matter how comfortable Edgar made the pen, Daisy would somehow manage to climb out and find her way to Mittens's side. Eventually, Edgar gave up on the pen altogether, recognizing that Daisy had chosen her sleeping arrangements and saw no reason to argue with success. As the days passed, Edgar's once quiet cabin filled with new sounds, the soft patting of paws on wooden floors, the gentle scratching of claws on doorframes, and the subtle rustlings that came with having two active animals sharing his space. It was like having children in the house again, something Edgar hadn't experienced since his nephew had visited decades earlier. Daisy grew with remarkable speed, her black fur becoming thick and glossy, her injured paw healing cleanly under Edgar's careful attention. What struck Edgar most was how gentle she remained despite her increasing size. Her eyes never lost that soft, understanding expression that had first captured his heart, and she seemed to approach life with a calm acceptance that was both endearing and remarkable for such a young wild animal. The most entertaining aspect of Daisy's growth was her unwavering devotion to copying everything Mittens did. If Mittens jumped onto the windowsill to watch the birds outside, Daisy would lumber over and attempt to do the same, usually with less graceful results. When Mittens curled up on Edgar's favorite armchair, Daisy would squeeze herself in beside the cat, often displacing Mittens entirely through sheer size rather than any aggressive intent. Mittens, for her part, seemed to take her role as Daisy's mentor seriously. She would demonstrate proper grooming techniques, show Daisy the best sunny spots for afternoon naps, and even share her food. Though Edgar was careful to provide species-appropriate meals for each of his companions, the relationship between the two animals was unlike anything Edgar had ever witnessed, a genuine friendship that transcended the natural boundaries between predator and prey. Winter's approach brought new challenges and unexpected delights to the little household. Edgar had always been self-sufficient, but caring for two animals required adjustments to his routines and preparations. He stocked up on additional supplies, reinforced the cabin's insulation, and made sure his firewood supply would last through the coldest months. Riley Sanders had visited twice more, each time expressing amazement at Daisy's progress and the remarkable bond she shared with Mittens. "I've been doing this job for 8 years, Riley had said during his last visit. And I've never seen anything like this. She's not just surviving, she's thriving, and that relationship with your cat is something special." The official permit had arrived in November, a formal document that made Daisy's presence in Edgar's home legal and permanent. Edgar had framed it and hung it near the front door, not out of bureaucratic pride, but as a symbol of the family they'd become. The incident with the cardboard box occurred on a particularly cold December morning. Edgar had received a grocery delivery the day before, and in his haste to put away the perishables, he'd left the empty cardboard box sitting on the kitchen floor. When he came downstairs that morning, he found Mittens had claimed it as her new fortress, sitting inside with just her white head and green eyes visible above the cardboard rim. "Looks like you've found yourself a new castle," Edgar chuckled, reaching for his coffee mug. Mittens responded with a dignified meow, as if to say that yes, this was indeed her castle, and she was quite pleased with the accommodations. She tucked her tail neatly around her paws and assumed the alert posture of a cat surveying her domain. Daisy, who had been dozing by the fireplace, opened one eye at the sound of Edgar's laughter. When she spotted Mittens in her new hideout, her interest was immediately piqued. She lumbered to her feet, no longer the tiny cub Edgar had rescued, but a young bear who now weighed nearly 40 pounds, and approached the box with the careful curiosity that characterized her approach to all of Mittens's activities. What followed was a comedy of errors that had Edgar laughing until tears ran down his cheeks. Daisy, determined to join Mittens in whatever new game this was, attempted to climb into the box. She managed to get one large paw inside, then carefully placed her other front paw next to it. The cardboard creaked ominously under her weight, but Daisy persevered, slowly working her hind legs into the increasingly cramped space. The inevitable happened when Daisy tried to settle her full weight into the box. The bottom gave way with a satisfying ripping sound, and suddenly Daisy found herself wearing the cardboard box like an ill-fitting sweater, her round bottom and hind legs protruding comically from the torn opening. Mittens, displaced by the structural failure of her fortress, jumped gracefully to safety and began grooming herself with the dignified air of a cat who had never been involved in such undignified proceedings. Daisy, meanwhile, seemed genuinely puzzled by her predicament. She turned her head to look at Edgar, the cardboard box still draped over her shoulders like a cape, her expression clearly asking for help in understanding what had gone wrong. The sight was so endearing that Edgar had to sit down in his chair to catch his breath from laughing. "Oh, Daisy girl," he managed between chuckles. "I think that box was designed for someone a bit smaller than you." It took several minutes to help Daisy extract herself from the remains of the cardboard box, and even then, pieces of it clung to her fur like confetti. She shook herself vigorously, sending cardboard fragments flying around the kitchen, then looked at the destroyed box with what Edgar could only interpret as an apologetic expression. Mittens, having completed her grooming, approached the scene of destruction and sniffed delicately at the cardboard remains. She then looked up at Edgar with an expression that clearly conveyed her opinion of bears who couldn't properly appreciate the finer points of box occupation. The box incident was just the beginning of Daisy's attempts to live as a cat. She learned to climb onto the windowsill to watch the birds, though her weight often resulted in concerning creaking sounds from the window frame. She discovered the dry, sunny spots on the floor, though her idea of a comfortable napping position often involved sprawling across the entire width of the cabin's main room. The laundry basket incident occurred a few weeks later. Edgar had been doing his weekly washing and had left the wicker basket on the floor while he hung clothes on the line outside. When he returned, he found both Mittens and Daisy attempting to share the basket's confines. Mittens had claimed the bottom of the basket, curled into her usual perfect circle, while Daisy had somehow managed to squeeze herself in on top, her weight causing the wicker sides to bow outward alarmingly. Edgar watched in fascination as the basket slowly gave way under Daisy's enthusiastic participation in what she clearly saw as another of Mittens's excellent ideas. The wicker finally surrendered with a series of small popping sounds, leaving both animals sitting in a nest of broken basket pieces, looking surprised, but not particularly concerned about the destruction. "Well," Edgar said, surveying the damage, "I suppose I needed a new laundry basket anyway." Mittens extracted herself from the wreckage with feline grace, while Daisy required assistance to untangle herself from the wicker remains. Once free, she sat among the broken pieces with an expression of mild confusion, as if wondering why human furniture wasn't built to accommodate bears who simply wanted to nap with their cat friends. The bathtub discovery happened on a particularly warm afternoon in late winter. Edgar had been working in his workshop behind the cabin, repairing a chair leg, when he heard unusual splashing sounds coming from inside the house. Concerned that perhaps a pipe had burst, he hurried inside to investigate. What he found in the bathroom defied explanation. Somehow, both Mittens and Daisy had managed to squeeze themselves into the old clawfoot bathtub, which Edgar had filled with water earlier for his evening bath. Mittens was perched on Daisy's back like a ship's captain, completely dry and looking quite pleased with herself, while Daisy sat contentedly in the water, her thick fur soaked, but her expression serene. "How in the world did you two manage this?" Edgar asked, though he knew better than to expect an answer. Mittens responded with a purr, while Daisy simply blinked at him with those gentle dark eyes, as if sitting in bathtubs with cats was the most natural thing in the world. Edgar realized that Daisy must have seen him taking baths and decided this was another human activity worth investigating, while Mittens had simply taken advantage of the situation to claim the highest, driest spot available. Getting them out of the tub required considerable effort and resulted in Edgar getting nearly as wet as Daisy. But the sight of the two animals sharing such an unlikely space filled him with the kind of joy he hadn't experienced in years. It was the joy of unexpected moments, of life surprising him with its capacity for wonder. Even in his 8th decade, word of Edgar's unusual household had begun to spread throughout the small community around Deep Hollow Creek. The mailman, Tom Bradley, had been the first to spread the tale after spotting Daisy sitting calmly in the bicycle basket Edgar had attached to his old bike for trips to town. Tom had initially thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Surely that couldn't be a bear wearing a hand-knitted blue collar, sitting next to a white cat as Edgar pedaled slowly down the dirt road. But when Tom mentioned it at the general store, other neighbors confirmed similar sightings. Mrs. Henderson, who lived about a mile down the creek, had seen Edgar walking Daisy on a leash like a dog, with Mittens following behind like a feline chaperone. The Kowalski family, who ran the small farm on the other side of the forest, had spotted all three of them sitting on Edgar's front porch in the evenings, Daisy sprawled across the wooden planks while Mittens perched on her back and Edgar rocked gently in his chair. The first neighbor to actually visit was Mrs. Eleanor Jameson, an 80-year-old widow who lived in the old Victorian house near the main road. She arrived one sunny afternoon carrying a tin of her famous honey cookies, her curiosity finally overcoming her natural caution about visiting a man who supposedly kept a bear as a pet. Edgar welcomed her warmly, as he did all visitors, and introduced her to his family. Mrs. Jameson's initial nervousness evaporated when she saw Daisy, who was lying on her back in a sunny spot on the porch, all four paws in the air, looking for all the world like an oversized cat enjoying a belly rub from the sun. "My goodness," Mrs. Jameson breathed. "She's beautiful and so gentle-looking." Daisy, hearing the compliment in the woman's tone, if not understanding the words, rolled over and approached with the careful politeness she showed to all visitors. She sniffed delicately at Mrs. Jameson's offered hand, then lay down and rolled onto her side, clearly inviting the attention that most bears would never tolerate from strangers. Mrs. Jameson, enchanted, spent the next hour sitting on Edgar's porch, gently stroking Daisy's thick fur, while Mittens supervised from her perch on the porch railing. When Mrs. Jameson opened her tin of honey cookies, Daisy showed polite interest, sniffing at the offerings, but waiting for permission before taking one. "She has better manners than most children," Mrs. Jameson declared, charmed by Daisy's gentle behavior. What Mrs. Jameson didn't see was Mittens's stealthy approach to the cookie tin. While everyone's attention was focused on Daisy's polite cookie acceptance, Mittens had crept close enough to snatch a cookie of her own. Edgar caught sight of her retreating with her prize, the cookie nearly as large as her head, and had to suppress a chuckle at the cat's opportunistic behavior. After Mrs. Jameson's visit, other neighbors began stopping by, drawn by curiosity and the growing legend of the bear cat that lived with old Edgar Whitley. Each visitor left with the same amazed expression, having witnessed something that challenged their understanding of what was possible between humans and wild animals. The most significant test of their unusual family came on a bitter night in February when the worst snowstorm in years descended on the Blue Ridge Mountains. Edgar had spent the day preparing, bringing in extra firewood, checking the generator, making sure his animals were comfortable and safe. By evening, the snow was falling so heavily that he could barely see the forest edge from his kitchen window. Edgar had gone outside one last time before bed to check on his firewood supply, wanting to make sure he had easy access to fuel for the fireplace throughout the night. The snow was deeper than he'd expected, and the wooden steps were slick with ice. As he made his way carefully toward the woodpile, his foot slipped on a patch of hidden ice. The fall happened so quickly that Edgar barely had time to register what was occurring. One moment he was walking carefully through the snow, and the next he was lying on his back in the cold, his head spinning from the impact with the frozen ground. The world seemed to tilt and blur around him. And then everything went dark. Inside the cabin, Daisy and Mittens had been dozing by the fireplace when they heard the sound of Edgar's fall, a heavy thump followed by an ominous silence. Both animals were immediately alert, their instincts telling them that something was wrong. When Edgar didn't return after several minutes, they ventured outside to investigate. What they found sent both animals into immediate action. Edgar lay unconscious in the snow, his body already beginning to lose heat to the bitter cold. Daisy, despite her young age, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. She positioned herself across Edgar's body, using her thick fur and body heat to create a living blanket that would help prevent hypothermia. Mittens, meanwhile, climbed onto Edgar's chest and began meowing with an urgency and volume that was completely unlike her usual quiet demeanor. Her cries cut through the silence of the snowy night, a desperate call for help that carried farther than such a small voice should have been able to reach. It was Edgar's nearest neighbor, Jack Morrison, who heard Mittens's distress calls. Jack had been checking his own animals when the sound reached him, a cat's cry that spoke of genuine emergency. Following the sound through the falling snow, he discovered the remarkable scene of a young bear lying protectively across an unconscious man while a small white cat called desperately for assistance. Jack immediately called for emergency help while carefully moving Edgar into the cabin, with Daisy and Mittens following anxiously behind. The paramedics who arrived were amazed not only by Edgar's condition, he had suffered a concussion but would recover fully, but by the behavior of his animals. Daisy refused to leave Edgar's side throughout the entire rescue process, while Mittens maintained her vigil from her perch on Edgar's chest. At the hospital, Edgar regained consciousness to find Jack Morrison sitting beside his bed, ready to explain what had happened. The story of how his animals had saved his life filled Edgar with a profound sense of gratitude and wonder. He had rescued them, but in the end, they had rescued him in return. When Edgar returned home 2 days later, he found that word of the rescue had spread throughout the community. No longer did people refer to Daisy as Edgar's pet bear or express concern about the safety of having a wild animal so close to human habitation. Instead, she was spoken of with respect and admiration, a guardian angel in bear form, who had proven her devotion to her human family when it mattered most. The final weeks of winter passed peacefully in the little cabin by Deep Hollow Creek. Edgar's recovery was swift, aided by the constant companionship of his two devoted friends. Daisy seemed to have appointed herself as his personal guardian, rarely straying far from his side and always positioning herself where she could keep watch over him. Mittens, not to be outdone in devotion, claimed her traditional spot on Edgar's lap whenever he sat down, purring with the satisfaction of a cat who knew her place in the world was secure. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, Edgar found himself reflecting on the remarkable changes that had come to his life. A year ago, he had been a lonely old man living quietly in the mountains, his days marked by routine and solitude. Now his cabin rang with the sounds of life and companionship, filled with the presence of two creatures who had chosen to make him their family. On warm afternoons, Edgar would sit on his front porch, watching Daisy and Mittens play in the yard. Daisy had grown into a magnificent young bear, her coat glossy black, and her movements graceful despite her size. Yet she retained the gentle nature that had first endeared her to Edgar, approaching life with a calm curiosity that never failed to amaze visitors. Mittens, now a sleek and confident cat, ruled their small domain with the quiet authority of someone who knew her worth. She had trained both Edgar and Daisy to understand her needs and preferences, and both of her companions were happy to comply with her feline requirements. The sign that Edgar hung on his porch that spring was simple but meaningful: home of Edgar, Mittens, and Daisy, our little family. It was a declaration to the world that this was a place where love transcended the boundaries of species, where a man, a cat, and a bear had found in each other the family they had all been seeking. Riley Sanders continued his annual visits, each time marveling at the continued success of this unlikely arrangement. Daisy remained healthy and content, showing no signs of the behavioral problems that often plague captive wildlife. Her bond with Mittens had only grown stronger with time, and her devotion to Edgar was absolute. "You know," Riley said during one of his visits, watching Daisy carefully navigate around Mittens, who was sunbathing in the middle of the porch, "I've seen a lot of wildlife rehabilitation success stories, but nothing quite like this. She's not just surviving. She's thriving in ways that wouldn't be possible in any other environment."